In particular, in question 4 here, we're really excited about part C. Part C is the first time that we have a translation that's up or down. Part A and B are review questions from things we've done before. So we'll do them again. Again, this one does tell us a specific domain, so that will make, in particular, part B a little bit harder. But we're still going to do part A and part B as if we were just graphing at least one period, and then we're going to worry about the domain afterwards. So in part A, that 3, it's a vertical stretch. That's going to affect your amplitude. So instead of going up only to 1 and -1, it now goes up to 3 and -3. The period of this graph is still going to be 2 pi, so you can mark 2 pi, divide it into 4 equal sections. And where does the sine graph start? In the middle going up, so middle to max to middle to min to middle. So you can already see the shortcut. We didn't take all 5 of those points and multiply the y values by 3 and find out where the points went. We can just use middle to max to middle to min to middle. So this is what the graph would look like. Ooh. This is what the graph would look like if we continued it forever. If we wanted to do just between 0 and 2 pi, I'd take out my eraser and stop it at 2 pi. And stop it at 0. There's part A, review of example 1, working with your amplitude. I find that using a capital A for that first value really helps you remember that that stands for amplitude. Part B. Part B is a horizontal compression. So you're going to multiply your x values by 1/3. It means when you go out to draw it, your amplitude is still 1, so it's going to go from -1 to 1. And now our period is going to be, and because I've done this question before, normally I'd put my period anywhere along here. This time I'm going to start my period right here to leave space, because I know that I have to graph it between 0 and 2 pi in the end. 1 full period will be 2 pi over 3. So as far as planning things for later on, because this graph says to graph it exactly between 0 and 2 pi. It doesn't say just graph at least one period. If this is 2 pi over 3, does that make sense that if I took from 0 to 2 pi and divided it into 3 equal sections, that this is where 2 pi over 3 would be? Since that's 1 full period, I need to take my full period and divide it into 4 equal sections. What's half of 2 pi over 3? 2 pi over 6 or pi over 3, right? What's half of pi over 3? Pi over 6. And if this is 1 pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, this will be 3 pi over 6. I'll write it in green up here. And that, if I simplified that, that would be pi over 2. So I take my period, I divide it into 4 equal sections. I say, where does the sine graph start? In the middle going up. And now normally, you would just graph at least one period, put arrowheads on the end, and you would be done. But this question says, do it between 0 and 2 pi. So here's 0. It's already starting at 0, so I can erase this part. How do I graph it from 0 to 2 pi? Well, every 2 pi over 3 is a full period. So can you see that there's going to be another full period up to here? So if I divide this section into 4 equal parts, and another full period here, so I'm going to divide this section into 4 parts. And we continue with the middle to maximum to middle to minimum to middle to maximum to middle to minimum to middle. And so another pattern that we notice with our b value is when our b value is 3, there is now three periods between 0 and 2 pi. Normally we had 1 period between 0 and 2 pi, but that compression of a third squishes them, and now we would have 3 periods. If it was a 6 inside, you'd have 6 periods between 0 and 2 pi. We're going to do some questions later on that I'm going to call multi-revolution questions. And they're going to say, how many times does it, between 0 and 2 pi, does it go through now? Well, this has 3 periods between 0 and 2 pi. And so this is how you would graph this one exactly between 0 and 2 pi. Again, for the most part on your exam, they'll say graph 1 period. So this first little section that we did would be enough. And finally, part C is the first time that we're looking at what happens when we do a vertical translation. Something we have ignored in all of the graphs up till now has been our center line. I mean, our center line's right on the axis. It was easy to ignore. But when you shift things up and down, this +3 is really going to affect that center line. And so when we go to graph it, that center line is going to be at 3. And we're going to draw it with a dotted line. It's not an asymptote. Again, a dotted line in a graph is something that's not part of the graph, but is supposed to help you graph it. So you've had dotted lines with asymptotes. They're not actually part of the graph. They help you draw things. You've had, maybe you did a dotted line for the axis of symmetry in a parabola. Right? It's not part of the parabola, but it helps you see the symmetry of the parabola. And so our center line we draw as a dotted line because it's going to help us see what we need to do with our graph. What's the amplitude of this graph? It's still 1. So the amplitude is the distance from the center line to a maximum, or the center line to the minimum. So can you tell me what our maximum value is going to be on this one? 4. And our minimum value? 2. So again, we're seeing a little bit of the shortcut that we're going to use. Because we know the amplitude is 1, and because we know the center line is at 3, we're going to know that our maximum's at 4 and our minimum's at 2. Where does a sine graph start? In the middle, going up. And this is also why it's important to draw this center line. There's our middle on our center line. Now, before I can graph it, I still need to, on my x-axis, what's our period in this case? It's 2 pi. Divide that into 4 equal sections. Pi, pi over 2, 3 pi over 2. And now, since we know it's in the middle going up, and we've got our maximum and our minimum labeled, we can go from middle to maximum to middle to minimum to middle again. Normally I would draw those arrowheads, and then I'd realize, oh, they wanted me to graph it just from 0 to 2 pi. So I'll take out my eraser. Actually, I really like using this eraser, so it's so much fun. So enjoyable. Yeah, when you guys leave, all I do all day is erase all my notes slowly. No, just kidding. So there we have the graph, and now we see that that D value, because that's the last thing, the vertical shift up and down, that moves your center line. So the questions for this one are 6 and 7.